A different kind of alarm clock. Do you remember a time when mornings didn't begin with the buzz of a smartphone, but with the gentle clink of a glass milk bottle on the front step? There was a rhythm to life then, a quiet one. You didn't need an alarm clock. The low whistle of the coalman making his rounds through the foggy streets was enough to let you know it was time to rise. And if you were lucky, the wireless radio would crackle to life with something brand new, perhaps the Beatles playing for the very first time. And if just hearing that stirs something deep inside you, a smile, a memory, or maybe even a lump in your throat, then you already understand. This story isn't just about the past. It's about how it felt to live in a time when the world was changing, but everything still felt familiar. Welcome to the United Kingdom in the 1960s. It was a decade like no other. A moment in history when London was bursting into color, yet most families still watched the telly in black and white. When young women stitched their own miniskirts and boys traded their father's drab wool jackets for sharp suits and scooters. It wasn't just a trend. It was a quiet rebellion, with fabric, music, and attitude as its weapons. There was something electric in the air. You couldn't always name it, but you felt it. The future was knocking, and for once it sounded like something you wanted to answer. Life wasn't flashy. Not yet. People still lit coal fires and bought vinegar-drenched chips wrapped in newspaper. But something had shifted. Young people were no longer content to walk the same paths as their parents. They wanted to dance, to sing, to stand out. This wasn't a generation looking back. They were looking forward. And for the first time, the rest of the world was watching. So what made the 1960s in Britain so special? It wasn't just the Beatles or Mary Quant's mini skirts, or the mods with their slick hair and shiny scooters. It was the moment when young people found their voice and decided to use it. When the culture didn't trickle down from the top, it rose up from the streets. For many, it began with small acts of independence, a different haircut, a new record, a shirt your father wouldn't be caught dead in. But these weren't just fashion choices, they were statements. And together, they formed the heartbeat of a cultural revolution. There's a story I once heard about a boy named Alan, born in Liverpool in 1951. He remembered the first time he heard the Beatles on the radio. His father marched into the room, turned it off, and muttered something about noise. That night, Alan snuck under his blanket with a transistor radio and listened anyway, volume turned down low. It was the first time I felt like I was choosing something for myself, he said. Like I wasn't just living my father's life. And that's the spirit of this decade. Change didn't come from protests or speeches. It began with a whisper, a song, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, the world didn't have to stay the way it was. The 1960s weren't about leaving the past behind. They were about building something new on top of it. A little louder, a little bolder, a little more alive. The faces and places that shaped a generation. If the 1960s in Britain had a capital, it was London. But not the stiff, grey London of post-war postcards. This was a new kind of city, alive, pulsing with energy, daring to be young. And if there was a single street where that energy walked, talked, and danced, it was Carnaby Street. To the outside world, it looked like a row of shops. But to a generation coming of age, Carnaby Street was a kind of cathedral, where the altar was a boutique window, and the sermons were written in bold colors and impossible hemlines. Designers like Mary Quant didn't just sell clothes. They sold freedom. Her mini-skirts weren't scandalous, they were statements. Statements that said young women could dress for themselves, live for themselves, and step out of the shadows of expectation. And then there were the haircuts. Vidal Sassoon, with his geometric cuts and architectural bobs, didn't just change how women looked. He changed how they moved. Gone were the stiff rollers and hours under the dryer. In came sleek lines, wash-and-go freedom, and a new kind of beauty that didn't apologize for being modern. For young men, it was all about the mod look, sharp suits, narrow ties, and an attitude that said, "We're done waiting." These weren't aristocrats. They were working-class teens with Italian scooters and record collections that reached across the Atlantic. They didn't walk down the street. They glided, chrome mirrors sparkling in the London drizzle. And just like that, the old rules started to break down. The class system didn't disappear overnight, but in places like Carnaby Street, it stopped mattering so much. Suddenly, style wasn't about money. It was about imagination. The right jacket, the right hair, the right attitude, and you could reinvent yourself completely. It's easy to look back now and see it as just fashion. But if you were there, you knew better. Every hemline was a revolution. Every haircut was a push against the past. When music spoke louder than politics, it didn't start with a headline. It started with a sound, a scratchy guitar riff, a drum beat that pulsed like a heartbeat, and then a voice. Not American, not polished, but unmistakably British. When the Beatles first broke through, they didn't just climb the charts, they reshaped them. Suddenly, music wasn't just entertainment, it was identity. It was the language of youth. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, the Who, these weren't just bands, they were movements. Each song wasn't just a hit, it was a declaration. A reminder that this generation was listening and being heard. And it wasn't just about the music itself, it was about the way it traveled. Transistor radios tucked under pillows, record players spinning until the grooves wore thin. Teenagers forming garage bands after school, convinced the next hit could start in their bedroom. And sometimes it did. British music crossed the Atlantic and crashed into American shores like a tidal wave. They called it the British Invasion, but there were no armies, just guitars. No uniforms, just mop tops and mod jackets. And for once, Britain was setting the tone for what was cool, worldwide. But this music wasn't just fun. It carried something deeper: frustration, freedom, longing. Songs like A Hard Day's Night or My Generation didn't just entertain, they gave voice to feelings most teens didn't have the words for. Behind the scenes, clubs like the Marquee or the Scotch of St. James became the incubators of this new sound. There, in smoky rooms packed with sweat and noise, something bigger was forming. Not just a music scene, but a cultural awakening. Even the government took notice. British youth, once expected to stay quiet and follow rules, were suddenly louder than ever, and they had the charts to prove it. This was no longer a rebellion whispered behind closed doors. It was sung at full volume. When society looked in the mirror for every teenager singing into a hairbrush, there was a parent shaking their head in the kitchen. For every new haircut, new skirt, or new sound, there was a neighbor, a teacher, a politician, wondering, what's happening to this country? The 1960s in Britain weren't just exciting. They were deeply unsettling to those who had built their lives on structure and stability. After all, this was a country still recovering from war. For many, rebellion wasn't glamorous. It was dangerous. And yet, it was everywhere. Television, once safe and proper, suddenly had teeth. In 1962, that was the week that was, TWW3 debuted. Cheeky, unfiltered, and unforgiving. Hosted by a young David Frost, it mocked politicians, poked fun at royal scandals, and turned the BBC into a lightning rod for debate. Satire, once reserved for the drawing room, had gone prime time. Cinema, too, was changing. Gone were the polished romances and noble war films. In their place came gritty, unflinching stories, A Taste of Honey, Saturday Night, and Sunday Morning. These kitchen sink dramas showed the truth of working-class life. Cramped flats, strained marriages, teenage pregnancies, and quiet desperation. For the first time, ordinary people saw themselves on screen, not as background, but as center stage. These weren't just new genres. They were reality, projected 30 feet high. Not everyone was thrilled. Letters flooded newspapers. Public debates raged. Church leaders warned of moral collapse. But for the young, the poor, the overlooked, it was liberating. The message was clear. You exist, and your story matters. And in homes across Britain, uncomfortable conversations began, between fathers and sons, mothers and daughters. Some turned into arguments, others into understanding. Because society, like a mirror, had been forced to look at itself, and not everyone liked what they saw. What remains after the music fades. When people talk about the 1960s, it's easy to remember the fashion, the music, the headlines. But the real legacy isn't in the photos. It's in the way people saw themselves differently afterward. Before the 60s, most people in Britain knew their place. You were born into a class, a town, a future, and you stayed there. But by the end of the decade, that idea had been shaken loose. You could wear velvet if you were a bricklayer. You could grow your hair long, even if your father wore a military buzz cut. You could be seen, even if no one had seen you before. This shift wasn't just about youth culture. It was about dignity. Take men's fashion, for example. Before the 1960s, British men were expected to dress modestly. Gray suits, brown tweed, nothing too loud. But then came the Peacock Revolution. Suddenly, shops like Granny Takes a Trip and designers like Michael Fish encouraged men to dress with flair, pink shirts, floral jackets, even ruffled cuffs. It wasn't just fashion. It was a message: I have nothing to hide. And that message rippled across the country. Young people from industrial towns started bands, wrote poetry, made films, not to impress the elite, but to express themselves. It wasn't about becoming famous. It was about being real. And once that door was opened, it never really closed. You can still hear echoes of that today in the way we talk about self-expression, gender, equality, and class. The words may have changed, but the spirit began there, in a smoky London club, or a crowded boutique, or a living room where someone turned up the volume just a little louder. The 1960s didn't fix everything. They didn't erase inequality or end all conflict. But they gave permission to question, to challenge, to try. And maybe, more than anything, they reminded a generation that the most radical thing you can do is to simply be yourself. The echoes still ring. So what do we do with a decade like the 1960s? Do we frame it in black and white photos, hang it on the wall, and call it history? Or do we listen a little closer to the music, the voices, the crackle of change still humming under the surface? Because the truth is, the 1960s never really ended. They just changed shape. You can still feel them in the way young people challenge authority today, in the boldness of streetwear, in the raw honesty of modern music, in every act of self-expression that says, "This is who I am and I'm not hiding." The hairstyles are different. The slang has shifted. But the spirit, the urge to be seen, to matter, to live out loud, is the same. Even the everyday things from that era, the milkman, the coalman, the neighbor who knocked just to say hello, remind us of a rhythm of life that was slower, more human. Maybe that's why the memory lingers. Not just for what changed, but for what was lost along the way. In the end, the story of Britain in the 1960s isn't just about youth, rebellion, or fame. It's about belonging. A generation stood up and said, "We're not content to inherit the world as it is. We want to shape it." And they did. Now, the question falls to us. What do we carry forward? Do we dare to be as bold, as curious, as unapologetically ourselves? Because maybe the past isn't past at all. Maybe it's just waiting, like an old record, ready to play again, when the needle drops in the right place. So next time you hear a Beatles song, or see a photo of Carnaby Street, or pass by a vintage scooter parked on the curb, don't just smile at the nostalgia. Ask yourself, what would I have done in that moment? And better yet, what can I do now?